This project was part of my postdoctoral degree that I've carried out with Dr. Jamatali. Unfortunately, she's not here today. This was a grant by the Topoi Institute in Germany, and we're very thankful for them for the opportunity they've given us. So this project, as I've written here on the many gates of Thebes, is on the exploring the negotiation of heritage landscape of the famous World Heritage Site of the Theban necropolis in Luxor from the perspective of the multiple stakeholders who use it. We will present an overview of the project and its relevance to the existing academic work before moving on to discuss the theoretical and practical aspects of the research framework and highlighting also some of our findings through the different voices that we worked with, and then draw some preliminary conclusions. Quickly. The project focuses on the area of the Theban necropolis, known today as Qurna, on the west bank of the Nile in modern Luxor, around 800 kilometers south of Cairo. Similar to hundreds of sites in Egypt, Qurna has been the target of over 200 years of archaeological exploration, motivated by political and economic gain, alongside of course, academic research. Until recently, Qurna was home to around 20,000 people who have, for many generations, built on top of and incorporated into their houses many of the ancient Egyptian tombs. The area provides a poignant case of the way in which traditional academic study of the ancient Egyptian past, alongside the impact of UNESCO as a World Heritage designation with all its associated concepts of authenticity, which we very much doubt in this project. Of course, the constant academic research led to the marginalization and eventual removal of the contemporary communities. Here we've tried to explore how this removal came about, its impact on the relocated communities, and their changing relationships with archaeologists, tourists, government officials, and other stakeholders who make use of the archaeological space. So, to put this in context, we start with the history. Of course, the area of al-Qurna, as everyone knows, in antiquity was called Ta'adenet, or the peak, because it looks like a pyramid-shaped hill. And it's the same reason. It comes from the Arabic horn, or qurn, in Arabic, for an animal. The history of the village dates back to the 13th century, and with the advent of the European travel to the region in the 1700s, the inhabitants moved south to live in the area of the Hatshepsut Causeway, Sheikh al-Qurna, al-Khocha, and the Saf tombs in Drab al-Mecca. This relocation enabled residents to aid foreign excavations, sell antiquities, act as guides, and provide accommodation for tourists inside white brick houses and modified tombs. This was not the first time the tombs were lived in, since they have already served as hermit cells for Coptic monks in the early centuries, and generally would have provided shelter during the high inundation season of the Nile floodplain when the inundation was quite high. And you can see this is an example of the modern houses in New Qurna. However, the Western invasion of the area, as I call it, created a whole new set of complex social dynamics surrounding the role of the tombs in the daily Qurnawi life. For example, when the archaeological missions in the 1980s were happy to use Qurnawi laborers, and tourists enjoyed buying crafts, products, and interacting with the locals. Once the Egyptian government and foreign academics realized the value of the area for research and tourism, the local community came to be seen as a nuisance. Reports of Qurnawis as tomb robbers and defilers of the historic sites began to circulate. Whether conscious or not, the propaganda was an attempt to drive a wedge between the land and the families who had lived on and the tombs for generations. And of course, during this very big time, they've developed strong ancestral ties and traditions which were intimately connected to to the archaeological site. Anti-Qurnawi feeling continued to grow until in the 1940s, the first official government relocation plan of the inhabitants of al-Qurna emerged, designed by the architect Hassan Fathi as part of the Fallah problem. The village was relocated down the Nile Valley away from the archaeological site. While the project gained international recognition, it failed to tempt the residents away from the area because not only were the tombs their home and part of their extended identity, but because tourism and working for archaeological missions provided their only form of economic sustenance. While the 1940s relocation failed, powerful Western ideology continued to create an ideational space in which ancient and modern Egypt were completely hermetically sealed identities. The division was not confined to al-Qurna, but was and continues to be evident all over Egypt, and provides Western experts with privileged access to research on the ancient Egyptian past while denying living Egyptians identification with its history. Since 2006, UNESCO and Egyptian government cultural heritage management plan to create Luxor 2020 as an open-air museum. This has led to the destruction of all villages located in the area considered to be archaeological land in search of the authenticity. This encompasses all in all some 20 kilometers square and has forced the relocation of the residents on the Theban necropolis to the purpose-built site called New Qurna 5, some 5 kilometers away. Today, many new other projects are underway, such as the RC project there, trying to give the New Qurna a site that would look like a modern World Heritage site. This is the community again. Some archaeological teams are also contributing to further removal of communities from the area, such as in the village by the Ramesseum, where lowering the underground water to protect the temple's foundation is causing the nearby mud brick houses to collapse. Removing the village there, some around 30 families, partly on the archaeological land, will also enable the team to extend the limit of their excavation. These two examples begin to highlight the dynamic that exists between the community, Ministry of Antiquities, local governor, and foreign archaeological missions. The result of this history has been the creation of multiple coexisting worlds. One is an ideational Western academic space, where archaeological teams work with local communities in a World Heritage context, but have to negotiate their greater vested interest in the past. And another is a tourist space in which ancient Egypt is frequently viewed as a time-constrained identity, disconnected from today's Egyptian community, who are only encountered through the often uncomfortable buying-selling interactions. There is also the Ministry of Antiquities and the Egyptian government, who have a complicated history with the site and the community, as well as the foreign archaeologists and visiting tourists. At the same time, there's the Egyptian community that sees the area as a hope and an identity cornerstone in which contemporary daily life blends with the heritage and modern tourist economic activities. Aiming to present the imbalance of these multiple experiences and interpretations of the heritage landscape in the light of the current political changes in Egypt, Jem and I wanted to present the untold story of archaeology at Qurna and reveal how the past does not exist in isolation, merely as a World Heritage Site to be preserved in the state it was at its archaeological peak, but is a part of a continuum of history in which human dynamic relationships give meaning to the heritage in the same way archaeological sites give meaning to local communities, academics, and tourists. The project objectives that we worked on was to review the history of the archaeological intervention, tourism, and the Egyptian settlement, to review the community perspectives on other stakeholder groups at the Theban necropolis, and the role of the archaeological sites play in contemporary life, social, economic, culture, political, and emotional. The perceptions of archaeologists, tourists, artists, and other Egyptian and foreign stakeholder groups visiting and working in the Theban necropolis on their personal relationships with the archaeological sites, the local community, and non-residential stakeholders. It took us quite a lot of time to develop our theoretical framework based on our previous experiences with other communities and stakeholder groups in Egypt, and from a community archaeology and an archaeological ethnography approach. We started building links with different stakeholder groups and carrying out, as appropriately, informal and non-informal interviews to draw out on how each group saw their relationship with other stakeholders and how this sat along their personal relationship with the archaeological site. This is Gemma. The Venn diagram that we have created for our theoretical framework just illustrates visually how simply we're trying to access where and how these different worlds overlap. This was not an easy task, especially as the process was further complicated by our own preconceptions and personal relationship with the different groups and heritage landscape over the course of the fieldwork. For example, for Gemma, my colleague with a background as a community archaeologist and working in Egypt, she was very disappointed with foreign archaeologists. She found them very selfish and very self-contained in terms of their interaction with the local communities. For example, they gave rules for students not to interact, not to go out, and so on. But over time, from her experience as a single Western woman on the West Bank, she realized how difficult it is, and she could see why foreign archaeologists were setting these rules. So all this preconceptions and reflection work was also affecting the results of our study. So as a consequence of this, our methodology evolved over time, even though we both had a detailed understanding and experience of collaborative methodologies. Each project is unique and it needs to be developed in the specific context. For example, at first, Gemma and I divided our work that I would be interviewing mostly the Qurnawi community, the MSA personnel, and she would be interviewing the foreign archaeologists and the tourists. But then we realized that we're actually repeating the same dichotomy. She is being locked in the Western world on the Theban necropolis, and I'm being locked in the Egyptian side. So we've revised our methodology, and we've decided that we're going to go through all interviews together and reflect differently to see how our preconceived ideas on the events reflect differently on the research. And this is how we redefined, again, our methodology. Back to al-Qurna, this was right after 2011. We started fieldwork in October 2011. So we could see a lot of what was going on. And for example, even despite the wall that was built near Masqata, a lot of building and construction was happening very close by. Adding stories higher than what was permitted was going on. Same as here. And all the people who were relocated to Gornet Marai decided that they want to go back home. It was empty, there was no police, it was different than what happened with the start of the relocation in 2006. So the inhabitants returned back to Gornet Marai. And you can see here they returned back to the houses, even if they just wanted to get back to the space. A lot of also difficult, they did not get proper housing, or they did not get proper land, and just people started reappropriating back their space that they were that they left from. And even the football pitch started to be played back at, and children were going back to play football, although this was not happening the year before the revolution. We also conducted several school workshops on how the children saw ancient Qurna. And this is one of my favorite sketches, because you can see they've drawn different hills, houses, and there is a mummy inside one of the hills. So this is how the children saw their archaeological landscape. It's very different from how we archaeologists see it. They saw it as something very of their everyday life. Here as well, they still saw the houses on the mountain. This is how they saw al-Qurna, and so on. And then we decided that the best way to present the narratives from the different interviews that we were doing was not to make suggestions for changes of behavior or for a heritage policy, but to publicize how the different groups are perceived by other stakeholders, how their stories, perceptions, clash and overlap, and what each group hopes for the future of the heritage landscape. Seen in the slide, this research should be taken more as a learning experience, bringing diverse narratives to light, to raise awareness and enable stakeholders to see themselves and those they encounter in the Theban necropolis in a new light, as opposed to forcing our own view as heritage practitioners on how things should progress in the future. So we'll start by the first narrative. This was by a return visitor, a foreign return visitor. He said before they built New Gorna, it was better. It's not like it was when people were there. Now it's just tombs and temples. Tourists just take a look at the tombs and they do not have any connection. They, the local government, want to turn the place into a big Disneyland. They didn't like the people and the tourists coming together in the old system. And this is a narrative by a 40-year-old mother of 6 children who relocated to New Gorna, and she said, I missed the tombs, mainly for the extra money we could make out of the tourists who visited. This is also by another repeat visitor. He said, I liked the way the village, the houses, had all grown organically. They each had a unique history, which reflected each family, how it had grown, the marriages like a beehive, a honeycomb. The history was also written and painted on the walls, the trips to Mecca and so on. Every generation built on the last. And this is another 40-year-old man who relocated in New Gorna. He said, in Old Gorna we lived close, but with enough private space between the houses that kept the social balance between the families. However, here in New Gorna, if one sneezes, his neighbor will hear him. And this is also by two repeat visitors. He said, now it's a dead mountain. All the light, it takes a lot of energy that could be better used, and the tourists do not even look at it. I don't need it. It was better before. Also, what about the wildlife? It can't be good for that either. All this light, they have literally driven all the life away. And this is by an inhabitant, soon to be relocated from a village near the Ramesseum. She said, we are happy when we see tourists coming to the temple, because it's alive, and not just a group of stones. Here, this is a European artist and also a repeated visitor. Here, he says, here it's like a special kind of fieldwork. You see a certain kind of memory, thinking, and way of life that reminds us of what is really underneath the intellectual approach we have developed in the West. It is like a kind of a human archaeology. And a 40-year-old man said, we also listened to operetta that played in Hatshepsut Temple for free. Lots of archaeologists don't like modern Egypt. They are not even interested. And this is a conservator working on an archaeological mission. And this was by a 15-year-old female student who relocated to New Gorna, and she said, I want to be an archaeologist, to go and excavate back in Old Gorna. This is also another artist and repeated visitor. He said, the Western archaeologists are gold diggers. Of course, some are good and do a very academic job, rather than just pushing down their ideas. But I see that many bend the rules, and some are literally digging holes with no system. The Egyptians have known this land since childhood. They have played here and know where many things are. But often the archaeologists won't take advice. They don't always listen to the people. And this is by a Horabat elder, and he said people in Old Gorna lived on the hope that they will one day discover the treasure under their house and become rich. And this is by a 40-year-old returning inhabitant to Gornat Maray from El Boiret, because The people who lived in Qurna Marai come from a different tribe from the rest of Qurna. They come from al-Bu'ayrat, which is the village close to Medina Habu, while the rest of Qurna, they're Khurabat, and they're the other village. So also there are friction in moving them all together, and this is one of the main reasons they've returned to Qurna Marai, to stay very close to family, to go see cousins and grandmothers and so on. And here there's also another 27-year-old inhabitant from Qurna Marai. He said, in New Qurna there's nothing to do, just TV and satellite. But here we have a window to the world around us. These are our final conclusions, where again we're rethinking collaboration and the multiple meanings of heritage in Egypt and beyond. We're also rethinking of a new way of writing about heritage, which also documents change, reaching different audiences, raising awareness of the diversity of stakeholders in archaeological contexts, and also future plans that were suggested by the stakeholders. For example, the Qurnan said, we want a community museum. I want to be able to show my son and grandson how we carried water to the tomb, how did we cook. So the Qurnawis want to preserve their collective memory that they're losing very quickly. And they're also interested in more formal and informal learning engagement with heritage sites. Ecotourism, new heritage policy rules for cooperation between foreign missions, Egyptologists and communities, relevant training when desired. And I close very quickly with one of these very nice photographs that we did not show. This was a photograph, an old photograph from the hot air balloon for Qurna. But one of the kids actually drew something that was very similar to what we saw. And I would like to thank you very much. If you have any questions. Not really, because their origins are mostly Bedouins. They have Bedouin origins, so they were not mainly. The Khurabat used to be. Actually, the Khurabat also has a small, tiny Coptic community, but they're mostly they were Bedouin tribes. So they were not from the Nile Valley. From the 13th century, 17th century, yeah.
There's always been the reputation of those in Qurna knowing more about the tombs than virtually anybody, including the archaeologists.
I can definitely agree. Yes, they do. And even in the Amenemhat, the temple where the German mission was excavating, the chief of the workmen told the director, the mission director, dig here, you're going to find a statue, and she ignored him. Dig here, you're going to find a statue, and she ignored him. And finally, when she dug where he said, she found the statue. So they have an inherent knowledge of the places where they were born.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about whether the view that was taken at the time of the decision was made to take down the houses, whether that view is coming purely from a sort of academic view that we need to clean up the antiquities area and not let it be somehow damaged by modern living, or are there other cultural concerns that guided that decision? Because I'm also thinking about things like moving the Ramses statue from Ramses Square and the sort of decisions being made to really remove ancient Egypt from the midst of life in Egypt.
I think it's both. It's a mixture of both. And I think it all relates a lot to this romantic idea of authentic ancient Egypt. Wanting to, and ignoring, ignoring 200 years of modern Egyptian history. Because this site was inhabited by modern Egyptians up for 200 years. So we just decided to blindly ignore these 200 years as if wiping them out of the history, although I can see it as a palimpsest, that this also contributes to the history of this little necropolis. So I think it goes again to this academic idea of not seeing modern Egypt and just wanting to see ancient Egypt in this sterile landscape.